Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first event in our 8-part series, Reclaiming the Future, co-hosted by RSA Oceania and the RSA Sustainability Network. Humanity stands at a critical juncture. Our political, economic, and societal decision-making is focused on the short term and is threatening the long-term survival of our species and our planet. The path we choose from here will determine the legacy we leave for future generations. Now, more than ever, we urgently need to expand our time perspectives to think, dream, and plan for the long term. In this series, we look at how we can nurture our ability to think long and the practical approaches that are helping to drive this temporal change, from the movement for intergenerational justice to deep democracy to changing the narratives that shape our visions of the future. Ultimately, we ask, how can we reclaim the future for coming generations? To help us interrogate this topic and provide some context for the coming sessions, we're incredibly fortunate to be joined by acclaimed author, philosopher, and political sociologist Roman Krznaric, whose book The Good Ancestor was the inspiration for this series. Roman is a public philosopher who writes about the power of ideas to change society. His latest book, The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World, has been described as the book our children's children will thank us for reading. His previous international bestsellers include Empathy, The Wonderbox, and Carpe Diem Regained. Named by The Observer as one of Britain's leading popular philosophers, Roman's writings have been influential amongst political and ecological campaigners, education reformers, social entrepreneurs, and designers. He is the founder of the world's first empathy museum and is currently a research fellow of the Long Now Foundation. Roman, welcome.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Philippa. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gurungai people as the traditional custodians of the land where I grew up. And I think the acknowledgement of country is actually a really powerful way of connecting us with a different sense of time, which I think in a way what this series is all about connecting with elders past, present, and future, connecting with a sense of the land over millennia. And it is the opposite of the chronic short-termism in which we currently live. And I think we all know that we live in an age where our politicians can barely see beyond the next election or even the latest tweet, that businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report, that markets spike and crash in speculative bubbles, that nations sit around international conference tables bickering with each other while the planet burns and species disappear. And of course, as individuals, we're constantly looking at our phones and clicking on the buy now button. And so I really believe that we are living in the age of the tyranny of the now. And I think there's many ways in which I think we all can recognize the need for more long-term thinking in society. We need more long-term thinking and planning to deal with the next pandemic that might be on the horizon, to deal with technological risks that are coming our way, from artificial intelligence to bioweapons, to deal with racial injustice, which is deeply embedded in criminal justice institutions and other public institutions, which gets passed on from generation to generation. And of course, to deal with the ecological crisis, which is hitting us right now today, but is also going to be hitting us for decades to come and getting worse and worse. And any of you who've been reading the latest IPCC report, particularly the bits on Oceania, in fact, will be looking at these projections going forward to 2100, even 2300 for sea level rises, and realize and recognize that these impacts are going to be happening for long periods of time, getting worse and worse, devastating impacts, and we need to be shifting into a longer term mindset here. And the way I think about it is, this sort of whole issue in general is that we treat the future as a kind of dumping ground, a dumping ground for ecological degradation and technological risk. And we treat it as if there was nobody there. And of course, there are the billions upon billions of people who will inhabit the future. who are there. But the challenge is that they're given no political rights or representation, right? They're given no influence at the marketplace. They can't, go on a salt march to defy their colonial oppressors like Mahatma Gandhi, or stay just sit in like a civil rights activist. In a way, we're here to do it for them. That's partly what Extinction Rebellion is all about, and why I was on the streets with Extinction Rebellion recently in London, just last week. And I think that, the challenge here, though, in a way, is trying to connect with those future generations, that future world, in a visceral way. I mean, we know that there are 7.7 billion people alive today, and over the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born, amongst them all your grandchildren and their grandchildren and the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. And someone who really thought about this issue a lot was the great virologist Jonas Salk, who Philippa introduced you to earlier. And as you saw from that quote, Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine in the 1950s, later went on to say that the great question facing our civilization was that one that Philippa mentioned there: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by the generations to come? And he believed that if we were going to be remembered well, we would need to expand our time horizons. And instead of thinking on a scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, we need to think on a scale of decades, centuries, and millennia. And the real challenge, though, is how we do this. And this is partly what I want to just talk to you about today in this 25 minutes introduction before we have questions. How do we become long-term thinkers and escape from that chronic short-termism in which we're embedded? And the place I like to start is here in the human brain, and to think about our neurological wiring, the sort of human nature which we have evolved into, as it were. And the way I see it is that there's a constant struggle going on in the human mind between what I think of as the marshmallow brain and the short term and the acorn brain. So do we party today or save for our pensions for tomorrow? Do we upgrade to the latest iPhone or plant a seed in the ground for posterity? And the marshmallow brain is the part of our neuroanatomy which focuses on instant rewards and immediate gratification. And this is the story we're mostly told about what human beings are, and who we could be, that we are trapped in this kind of short-termism. And of course, the marshmallow brain is named after the famous psychology experiment from the 1960s, where a marshmallow was put in front of kids, and if they could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they're rewarded with a second marshmallow. But the majority of kids, it turned out, couldn't resist and snatched the snack and gobbled it up. Now, there's lots of critiques of the marshmallow test, right? That it depends on socioeconomic background, levels of social trust, and so on. But I think one of the most devastating critiques is it really ignores the importance of this other part of the brain, the acorn brain, as I call it, which lives here in the frontal lobe, particularly a part, if you're interested, called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of the human brain which focuses on long-term thinking and planning and strategizing. And it's a new part of the brain, admittedly. It's only a couple of million years old, whereas the acorn brain is about 80 million years old. We share it with rats and other mammals. But it's the acorn brain which enables us to take that long view, to be experts at the temporal pirouette. I mean, other creatures, other animals, do think and plan forward in time, of course. So a chimpanzee will get a stick, strip off the leaves, and turn it into a tool to poke into a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of those tools and set them aside for next week. But that is exactly what human beings do. That is our expertise, as I said, in the temporal pirouette, our ability to switch from short-term to long-term thinking. It's the acorn brain which has enabled us to save for our pensions or write song lists for our own funerals. It's the acorn brain which has enabled us to, build the Great Wall of China and voyage into space. But then there's a real question, I think, that remains hanging, which is, how do we put this acorn brain into practice? How do we bring it into our political, cultural, economic institutions? And in my book, The Good Ancestor, I'm just going to share my screen now. And hopefully you can see that there. In the book, I talk about a tug of war for time going on, not just in our own minds between the marshmallow brain and the acorn brain, but a tug of war between 6 drivers of short-termism and 6 ways to think long-term. And, this whole series is predicated on trying to emerge from the trap of these short-term drivers, how we do it. And a lot of those short-term drivers, of course, are very familiar. digital distraction, the way our attention spans have been hijacked by technology, political presentism, all those short-term electoral cycles that stop our politicians thinking long-term, the speculative capitalism that's particularly emerged since the rise of neoliberalism in the late 1970s, longer-term drivers of short-termism, like our obsession with progress emerging from the Enlightenment and the idea that our economies can keep growing and growing and growing, even though we know that nothing in nature grows forever, whether it's an oak tree or your children's feet. And then finally, at the top there, the tyranny of the clock, one of the deepest forms of short-termism, which goes back to the way that in Western culture, the way we measure time has been speeding up time and shortening the future. That the first mechanical clocks emerged in Italy in the 14th century. They used to chime roughly once an hour every 15 minutes. But by 1700, most clocks had minute hands. And by 1800 had second hands. That's the way the clock became the key machine of the Industrial Revolution, keeping those assembly lines moving. And now, of course, we've got the nanosecond speed share trading. So there's these deep drivers of short-termism, but they're matched by different ways to think long-term. And I know a lot of these ways to think long-term will be explored in more depth in some of the future talks in this series. And I'm really looking forward to hearing those. But I want to just say something briefly about a few of them, starting with the idea of cathedral thinking. And cathedral thinking is all about engaging in projects and plans with horizons going decades or centuries ahead, beyond our own career spans or beyond our own lifestyle spans, named, of course, after the idea of medieval cathedral builders who would start building their great religious edifices, knowing that they'd never be finished within their own lifetimes, like the great Lutheran church in southwest Germany, Ulm-Münster, which was begun in 1377. It wasn't finished until 1890, more than 500 years later, probably the world's longest crowdfunding project. But cathedral thinking isn't just about cathedrals. Of course, it's about other gigantic engineering works, like the sewers built in Victorian London and in Paris in the 19th century, which are still in use today. It's about social movements, which have long-term ambitions, like the suffragettes who were campaigning for 50 years for votes for women in many, many countries. It's also in the scientific world. Think, for example, of the Svalbard seed vault, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle, which is designed to last for 1,000 years, preserving the world's plant biodiversity in a kind of botanical Noah's Ark. Of course, it's already under threat by global heating. So you've got scientific projects like that, but then you can look around at indigenous cultures and other cultures. For instance, in Northeast India, in Meghalaya, there are these amazing examples of cathedral thinking. Doesn't look like a cathedral. This is an aerial root tree bridge, and there are many of these in Northeast India. They're created by weaving together the aerial roots of the aerial fig tree. They can take more than 20 years to create, and some of them have lasted for hundreds of years, like this one's over 200 years old. They require maintenance. This is about long-term cathedral thinking as well. Or consider great tree planting projects like the Greenbelt movement created by Wangari Maathai in 1977 in Kenya, which has since 77 has planted over 50 million trees and has trained over 30,000 women in agroforestry skills. This is a serious long-term cathedral thinking, but it's important to recognize that cathedral thinking isn't always good for us, that it can be put towards narrow and self-serving ends. A former head of the investment bank Goldman Sachs, Gus Levy, once said, "We're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy." And this goes for the corporate world, where there's a lot of long-term greedy going on. It goes for political regimes, which, like in North Korea, that want to preserve power from generation to generation. A couple of days ago, I was doing a talk for a Norwegian audience. We were talking about Norway's sovereign wealth fund, which is saved over $1 trillion for Norway's future generations. But the revenues for that sovereign wealth fund come from the country's oil and gas exports from the fossil fuel industry. So it's dumping problems on future generations while trying to help future generations at the same time. So there's a real tension there. So cathedral thinking isn't enough. We can't just think long term, which is what a lot of businesses are starting to talk about. We need to connect this long-term cathedral thinking with other concepts. And that's why I want to talk now just for a moment about intergenerational justice. And this is the idea of considering what are our obligations, our responsibilities to the generations of the future. And this is something that particularly interests me because back in the 1990s, I used to be a political scientist, and I was apparently officially an expert on democratic governance. But during that time, it never once occurred to me that we kind of disenfranchise future generations, that we fail to give them political rights or representation, and we need to change that. But how do we do that? And it's urgent that we do that, because you can have all the sustainable development goals in the world, but if your political systems are still caught in short-term cycles, you're not going to get very far. And I find a lot of inspiration in indigenous thinking and ideas of indigenous stewardship, particularly ecological stewardship, like the idea of seventh generation decision making found in Native American communities, Haudenosaunee, Lakota peoples, and in other parts of the world. And this is represented well by this great quote from Oren Lyons, where he says, "We're looking ahead, as is one of the first mandates given us as chiefs, to make sure that every decision we make relates to the welfare and well-being of the seventh generation to come. And that's the basis by which we make decisions in council. Will this be to the benefit of the seventh generation?" But the challenge here, of course, is, how do you put this kind of thinking into practice in sort of our postmodern, fast-moving societies and cities and so on? And there's a really lovely example of this, I think, which comes from Japan, which is a movement called future design, which is directly inspired by the Native American idea of seventh generation decision making, but they've kind of modified it for their own use. And this is a movement which is all about local government decision making. And what they do at future design is they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they typically divide them into two groups. Half of them are told they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these kind of ceremonial robes to wear that you can see. They're orange robes. In fact, I've got one right here with me now from the small town of Yahaba in northern Japan, population 30,000. And those who are wearing the robes are told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. So not quite 7 generations ahead, but 1 or 2 generations ahead. And it turns out that the residents from 2060 systematically advocate far more transformative plans for their towns and cities, whether it's healthcare investment or action on climate change or dealing with the threats of automation and AI. And this future design movement is now spreading throughout Japan. It's being used in big cities like Kyoto, Japan's Ministry of Finance, companies like Fujitsu. And it's a form of kind of citizen assembly in a way. It's about bringing people back into the heart of democratic decision making. So in a way, it's a great challenge also to the rise of far-right populism. So I think this is one way we can start rethink the institutions of the state and politics for a longer term viewpoint. Another interesting model you probably know about is in Wales, where they have a future generations commissioner whose job is to look at the impact of public policy up to 30 years in the future, whether it's economic policy, employment, healthcare, transport. And this model of a future generations commissioner is starting to spread. So in Scotland, there's a big debate about to emerge. It's already starting to emerge for Scotland to have a future generations commissioner. I'm also part of a campaign for the whole UK to have a future generations commission, not commissioner. So not a single person, but a kind of panel of experts and young people who would be inputting into government decision-making on long-term issues. And other countries are starting to have similar debates about whether they should have ministers of the future or future generations commissioner or ombudsman of the future. And I think so there's a lot of energy there. But I think the place where there's the most energy is in legal struggles to give rights to future people. This is a really important area, which I never thought would be as important when I was doing research for the book as it has started to emerge. So in the image there, you can see a photo of 21 young people who are part of an organization called Our Children's Trust, which is suing the US federal government on behalf of these young people who are campaigning for the right for current and future generations, their right to a clean climate and healthy atmosphere. So it's to try and stop the government, both federal level, also state level, to stop them subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. It's a David versus Goliath struggle. It's going to go on for years in the US, but it's already inspiring legal cases around the world in trying to give rights to the futures of young people or to unborn generations. So in the Netherlands, there's the Agenda case in this area. In Germany, the Constitutional Court has basically ruled that the government's carbon emission targets are violating the rights of future people because they're so limited. They're dumping problems on the future. In Australia, of course, there was in May, there was 8 young people and a nun whose name I can't remember, took government to court and basically established that the environment minister has a duty of care around with respect to the impacts of the fossil fuel industry and the rights of young people to a clean climate and healthy atmosphere, a bit like the US example. So there's a ton of action here. I never thought there would be as much action in this legal sphere because law tends to be quite slow, but it's actually acting pretty fast in this area. And another legal area that's important is the rights of the living world, not just rights of future people. So here is a picture of the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is being given the same rights as a human being, a bit like the way corporations were given rights in the late 19th century. And so there's a lot of legal struggles here about the rights of nature, around ecocide, and this is all about long-termism as well. But let me now just say something about switching from intergenerational justice to the idea of developing a legacy mindset. This is, again, one of these 6 cognitive tools, mental tools for long-term thinking at the heart of my book. And the idea of legacy mindset really goes back to that idea of sulk and how we're going to be remembered by the future. And I think that, legacy is really important because, we are the inheritors of very positive legacies from the past. So, the legacies of cities we still live in or medical discoveries like sulks that we still benefit from. But we're also the inheritors of negative legacies, legacies of slavery and racism and colonialism, creating deep inequities that must now be repaired, or legacies of economies that are structurally addicted to fossil fuels and endless growth that we must now transform. And there's a question there about how we're going to, or what we're going to leave to those generations of the future. But making those connections with future generations is quite difficult, particularly if we don't come from, say, an indigenous culture, which has long senses of ancestral connection and deep cosmological connections with the land. How do we do it? Well, the great thing is that human imagination can leap forward. We can use our acorn brains. And there's a little imaginative exercise I'd like you to take part in with me right now. This is developed by the Longterm project in London, and it's based partly on the work of Joanna Macy. It's called Human Layers. So what I'd like you to do for me now is this is going to take a couple of minutes. I want you just to close your eyes for a moment. Just take a deep breath. Center yourself in the now, and I want you to imagine in your mind's eye, I want you just to picture a young person in your life who you really care about. It could be a nephew or niece or child or grandchild. Just picture their face. And now I'd like you to imagine them 30 years in the future. Again, picture their face 30 years from now. Just think for a moment about the joys in their life and the struggles they might be facing. Hold that thought for a moment with your eyes still closed. And now I'd like you to imagine them on their 90th birthday party. They're 90 years old, surrounded by family and friends and loved ones and old work colleagues and neighbors. Just go to the window and have a look out the window. What kind of world do you see out there? And now come back in and you see that this 90-year-old stands up to give a birthday speech to their friends and family and loved ones. But instead of giving their 90th birthday speech, suddenly they see a photograph of you, their departed ancestor, over on the mantelpiece. And they decide to tell the gathered room about a positive legacy that you left for their world, something that you did for their generation. Just think for a moment about the speech they made about you, their departed ancestor, and what they said. And now just open your eyes again and come back to the present. Now, that kind of exercise can be challenging, especially if you've got a dark vision of the future. But I think it's really a fundamental way of helping us connect across the generations. That when I do that, I think of my daughter who's now 12, thinking her when she's 90. It could be nearly the year 2100. That future isn't science fiction. It's an intimate family fact. But if I think about my daughter in the future, I realize she's not alone in the world. She's part of a web of the community, the people that support her, but also part of the web of the living world, the air she breathes and the water she drinks. So what I get from that is, if I care about her life, I need to care about all life. That thinking about something familial and close is actually a bridge to a more universal sense of legacy, something larger. And I think that's something that we can all try and carry around with us in our daily lives. It's hard. And there's actually some really wonderful cultural projects which try and connect with this idea of legacy. One of them is called Future Library. It's a 100-year art project created by the Scottish artist Katie Patterson, where every year for 100 years, a famous writer is donating a book which is being kept in secret in a future library in Norway. And in the year 2114, the 100 books which will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees which have been planted in the forest outside Oslo. So Margaret Atwood, you can see there in the top left, was the first person to donate a book. Elif Shafak, the Turkish writer, and others have donated since. And just think, Margaret Atwood is never going to meet any of the readers of that book. She's never going to see it published in her lifetime. It's a kind of legacy gift to the future. And so I think we can all ask ourselves, well, what legacy gifts do we want to leave to the generations to come? And I think that's a question that we need to ask ourselves as individuals. But I also think that governments need to ask about what their legacies are going to be too. And in my book, just to shift from art to data, finally, before we go to some questions, I just want to show you this graphic here, which is from something called the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, developed by Jamie McQuilkin, which is a centerpiece of my book, The Good Ancestor, where we thought a lot about, the fact that there aren't very many good quantitative measures of how good governments are at long-term public policy. So Jamie developed this amazing index called the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, which ranks 122 countries on 10 different indicators and creates a composite indicator. A lot of my work, even though I'm a kind of public philosopher, I used to be a quantitative political scientist, so I kind of secretly love this stuff, though there are a lot of problems with trying to measure things. But what this index shows, when it ranks the countries, is that every country could be doing better on the Intergenerational Solidarity Index. There's quite a mix of countries in the top 20, like, from not just OECD countries. There's Iceland and Sweden, but there's Nepal, there is, Sri Lanka, there's Uruguay, there's Vietnam in there as well. The UK, where's that? That's down at number 45. Australia's number 50. The US is number 62. But the message of this index is that, every government could be doing so much more to improve their long-term public policy, because the kinds of measures included in it are based on environmental, social, and economic indicators. So the reason why the UK or countries like Norway, Australia do badly is because of partly to do with their fossil fuel production and exports, and they're punished for that. Whereas a lot of indexes in the world on equality or well-being don't take those things into account. So I think the Intergenerational Solidarity Index is one of the ways that we can start saying to governments, well, look, don't you want to try and go up the ranks here? What are you going to do to take a longer term perspective? So I just want to sort of draw this to a close now before we have, a discussion around this. Those are just a few of the ways we can start, in a way, challenging this chronic short-termism, the tyranny of the now that challenge us. And we can also try and bring these things into our daily lives. Just to finish, let me just say that a couple of weeks ago, I took part in a great kind of long-term ritual called chalking the horse. There's this 3,000-year-old Bronze Age monument about 20 miles from where I live, south of Oxford in the UK. It's a giant horse about 100 meters long, which has been carved into a chalk mountainside. And so you can see the sort of white horse, the white chalk with the green grass around it. And every year, for hundreds of years, local people have been going up to re-chalk the horse, smashing in bits of chalk and pulling out the weeds. And I went there with my daughter and with a friend of mine, the great biomimicry architect, Michael Pollan, who's a long-term thinker. He's got a book coming out on Longtermism very soon. And we spent hours with a group of friends from the Long Now Foundation, the London Outpost, banging in this chalk and you're feeling part of a 1,000-year-old ritual. And I think this is one of the ways we start getting long-termism into our bones. And these, I think, are the kinds of rituals in a way we need to invent in today's society to help us become the good ancestors the future generations deserve. And with that, I'd like to stop, and I can see people already asking questions in the chat, and I'll hand back over to Philippa.
Thank you so much, Roman. Really inspirational and really beautiful. Thank you so much for that. I just wanted to draw out a few of the issues that you raised and a few others that you mentioned in your book. And while I'm doing this, I really encourage everyone to post your questions in the chat, because I'm hoping we can get to quite a few. So don't hold back, do post. So firstly, I just wanted to ask you about the concept of relationality. So our next session will look specifically at relationality and the ethics of custodianship, drawing on Indigenous thinking and perspectives. You've spoken about stewardship as a deep instigator of long-term thinking and the importance of caring in particular for place. So what can we learn from thinking more relationally, not just in terms of our relationships with each other, which we've touched on, but also our connection to the land, our bioregion, and also the wider ecosystem?
Sure. So when I, about 5 years ago, started working on this book, The Good Ancestor, I was obsessed with time. I was thinking about how do we start imagining, not just tomorrow or next week, but next year, next decade, next century. But as I was doing the research on this, something occurred to me, which is probably going to be very obvious to you, which is that long-term thinking isn't just about time, it is about place. It's about a relationship with place. And the person who really helped me see this was the great biomimicry designer, Janine Benyus. And I really recommend her TED Talk and books and things if you don't know her work. And one of the questions she asks, I mean, she basically says, we need to learn from nature's 3.8 billion years of R&D. And she asks this question, how have other creatures learned to survive and thrive for 10,000 generations or more when they're not going to be around 10,000 generations from today? And, whether they're birds or beavers or bats. And her answer is this. She says, what evolution has taught us of what other creatures do is that they've learned to take care of the place that will take care of their offspring. In other words, they live within the boundaries of the ecosystem in which they're embedded. They don't foul the nest, which of course is what human beings have been doing at an ever increasing pace and scale over the last century. That's what the great acceleration is all about, all those curves going upwards of CO2 and ocean acidification and deforestation and so on. So it's about not fouling the nest. And what that means, it's about long-term thinking, is about preserving this place, restoring, repairing, caring for this living world, the one planet we know that sustains life, this unique planet. It's not about jetting off to Mars like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and so on. A mountaineer once told me that, if you want to climb a risky peak, make sure that your base camp is in order before you go up. And we haven't even learned to live within the boundaries of base camp Earth. So long-term thinking is ultimately about falling in love with the savannas, with the wetlands, with the mountains, with the rivers, with the meadows, reconnecting with the life-giving world. And there's this beautiful Mohawk blessing I came across in Janine Benyus's book, which is apparently spoken when a child was born. It goes like this: thank you, Earth, you know the way. So I think inside that is a kind of a secret to long-termism, because often people say to me, oh, it's too hard to think 7 generations ahead. I can't think 200 years from now and the world's so uncertain. Well, in a way, you don't need to. You just need to think about here and now and preserving the common denominator of the living world for all those future generations. So I think that ultimately, Philippa, I think there's a very strong link between sort of land and people. It's kind of inseparable when you start thinking about place.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Roman. And we're hoping to explore this in the next session with our speakers as well. We've got 2 wonderful Australian Indigenous speakers who'll be coming in to discuss this further. So I really recommend everyone join us for that discussion also. There's something else that's fascinated me, mostly because I read Giordano Nani's book, Colonization of Time, recently. So I'm going to ask you a what Doctor Who would call a timey-wimey question. And I have my Doctor Who mug here to commemorate that. So you were talking about the age of digital distraction and instant gratification. And one of the things, of course, that we really stop to think about is the concept of time itself, that time consciousness, as we know it, as you mentioned, is really a hangover of Western colonialism, what Giordano calls temporal imperialism. So what does this say about the narratives that shape our temporal imaginations and the potential to reshape our approach to the long term?
So I really like that concept of temporal imperialism, which I never heard before. I haven't read this book, but I like it. It feels right to me, because certainly the way I think about time is as a kind of imperialist or colonialist endeavor, the Western colonization of time. And actually, in my book, I talk about the idea that humankind, particularly in wealthy countries, the global north, that we've colonized the future, that we treat the future like a distant colonial outpost. And in the book, I connect it with the idea of terra nullius, the legal fiction, as it were, that, when, of course, Britain colonized Australia in the 18th, 19th century, they drew on this legal doctrine now known as terra nullius, the idea that there was nobody there on the continent. Of course, there was the indigenous population. And those struggles against terra nullius are still ongoing, of course, emerging from the Mabo case and Witt case and all this kind of stuff. But there's also something parallel going on, closely related, which is not just terra nullius, but tempus nullius, that we treat the future not as nobody's land, but as nobody's time, this uninhabited territory that is kind of ours for the taking. And I think this is this kind of temporal imperialism at work. And it particularly plays out in an imperialist way of the global north or the global south, or elites in one country over marginalized populations in another. Because who is going to experience the effects of the ecological crisis most, and who's already experiencing it? Well, it's people on the social margins and in the global south. And that's why Phil Alston, great sort of legal thinker who was the UN special rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, talked about the idea of climate apartheid, and he, in a big report that he wrote for the UN, where he pointed out that, say, when Hurricane Sandy hit New York in 2012, well, Goldman Sachs was fine. They had 10,000 sandbags in their own generators, but there were 500,000 New Yorkers, many of them people of color, and people living on the margins, who had no water or electricity or access to healthcare. And that's the world we're emerging into. So I think the idea of a temporal imperialism describes that really well. And I think this is one of the reasons why there's so much potential, I think, for coalitions of social movements around, say, racial justice and ecological justice. Those need to be tied more and more together. And in the UK, people like David Lammy, the Labour MP, are doing a lot of work around that. And I think it's really inspirational.
Thank you so much, Roman. There are so many questions coming through on the chat, so I won't be selfish and ask you any more from me, but I am going to bring in one from Philip Ward, who's the co-host of this series and the lead of the RSA Sustainability Network. And he mentions that in your book, you identify the practice of discounting future benefits in assessing investment decisions. And he asks, have you taken on any of the mainstream economists or accountants to challenge this insidious practice? And what is the current state of debate around this?
Sure. So I'm not an economist, though I did study economics a long time ago. And one thing even though actually I did study discounting, 30 years ago, when we had to do these little calculations of how it works, but we never really discussed the politics of discounting. And for those who are very familiar with the idea of discounting, it's a practice used by governments and businesses in their relationship to future impacts, earnings, planning. And so it's a bit like, the way, if you look at if you're just sort of looking out into the distance, the further and further away someone is, the smaller and smaller they get. Well, discounting is a bit the same. The further and further away people are in time, the less and less value is given to their welfare in decisions about, say, long-term investments. So a classic example would be, a long-term tidal energy scheme where when governments use these discount rates, say at 3.3 3% discount rate or something, what it'll mean is that the benefits of this, say, a tidal energy project to future generations are basically discounted away or diminished, so that those future benefits aren't brought in to the calculation with the same weight as benefits of something that might happen in the present day. And that means that a lot of long-term investments basically don't happen. So then there's a question of, okay, well, how much have I been engaging with the economists and debating with them about this kind of stuff? I've been trying to bring this in actually more to my discussions with governments. And I've had many discussions with government civil services, ministers in different countries about discount rates. Now, I'm not an expert on it by any means. I mean, luckily, my wife happens to be an economist, so she's the one that can talk about discount rates with more authority. In fact, she's an ecological economist. But one of the things I've been trying to point out is the way that, if you look at an economics textbook, and their discussions of discounting, they say, well, it's justifiable to discount benefits to future generations because we'll have economic growth, so they'll have more money to solve the problems they have, or there'll be technologies to solve their problems. But again, when I'm talking with policymakers and governments, I'm saying, well, economic growth is unlike, if you look at OECD economic projections for the next 50 years, they're not 3% growth rates year on year on year, and we can't keep growing like that. And in fact, no amount of growth or technology is going to reverse the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. So particularly when it comes to ecological risks, that the justifications for discounting are very weak. I mean, in a way, discounting isn't a form of intergenerational injustice dressed up to look like a rational economic methodology. People like the economist Amartya Sen have been critiquing discounting for years. Even the guy who invented discounting, Frank Ramsey, in 1928, very famous paper in mathematical economics, said that discounting the welfare of future generations is an unjustifiable failure of the imagination. That's a sort of a rough quote. And there are debates going on in lots of countries about where discounting should stand and whether discount rates should be lowered. I think I'm not sure about where the current debates are in the Treasury in the UK or in Australia, but I know other European countries are discussing discount rates. I've noticed that Robin in the chat has just mentioned that Lord Stern adjusted the discount rate to highlight the economic impact of climate change in his report on governments. Yes, he did. And the discount rate is split into two parts, and Stern basically adjusted one of them. So he was making some, steps towards challenging the kind of the cult of discounting, but it's still very much established. And there are differences between different countries. Cameron Hepburn and other economists have done good comparative studies of discounting. But I think there's a really good debate to have here. It should be matters of public policy debate, in around the world.
Thank you. And just building on that, because I've seen a few questions coming in around, the addressing the present needs of communities. One of the questions is about how we can involve marginalized and poorer individuals in communities so that they can be part of these movements of social change that you've mentioned. If they are affected by, pressing current circumstances, are they just too busy to survive their daily struggles to actually even be able to conceive of the long term?
Yeah, when I was writing this book, I had a lot of discussions with my dad about this, actually, because my dad was a refugee who came to Australia from Poland after the Second World War. And we were discussing about if you're a refugee, you've got present needs to meet, of course. Food on the table, looking after your children, dealing with racism, all sorts of stuff. And so one would think that it's justifiable to say, actually, there are huge sections of the population where thinking about long-termism might be considered a luxury, right? Because of people having to meet the needs of the present. But as my dad and others have pointed out, is that actually even refugees often have a very long-term view. Why is it that families from the Middle East and North Africa will try and cross the Mediterranean with a child in their arms and risk the child's life because they're trying to give the child a better future? They're thinking decades ahead already, even though they're often trying to meet the needs of the present day. And I think one also saw an element of this with Black Lives Matter too, that a recognition that the violence of criminal justice systems, policing systems happening today was also a product of long-term intergenerational injustices being passed on in public culture, in Hollywood films, all sorts of things that if you're going to tackle racial injustice for marginalized communities, you needed to start thinking really long-term. There's a really great project in the US called, oh God, I can't remember. I think it might be called Media 2070 or something like that. And what it is, it's a project where run by African-American communities and people of color. And it's to look at the way that the media has over the last couple of centuries been dominated by white privilege and white supremacy, white voices, and that they have a project over the next 50 years to try and challenge that and to try and equalize voices in the US media up to the year 2070. I think it's called Media 2070, but it's a really fantastic project. But I love the long-termism of it. But I think it's particularly addressing the needs of communities where, of course, there are issues here and now today. And I'd say something also finally about indigenous communities, that often it's indigenous communities who are certainly not privileged members of society who have the longest term vision. You know, think about the idea of whakapapa in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Maori concept of genealogy or lineage, the idea that we're part of a long chain going long into the past and far into the future. We need to shine the light more broadly because we're just so focused on the here and now. That's emerged from a culture which is, of course, suffers racial injustice today, but has an incredibly long-term view that we can all build on. So I think there's, again, lots of sort of confluences between the current and future, and not necessarily the kind of conflicts that many people think might be there.
Thank you, Roman. And I have to say, actually, one of the most evocative images in your book was when you mentioned that the country that you grew up in is on fire because, of course, you were writing at the time of the bushfires, and you mentioned your father in New South Wales. So it's strange, but when I finished reading your book, I was left with the thought, I hope he was okay, because you never mentioned. So I assume that he's all good, and he lived through that horrific experience. So
yeah, just actually on that, it was really interesting actually, because I phoned. I mean, the fires were about half a kilometer away from his house, and I said, "Dad, you've got to leave, the house," and he didn't want to go. And then my partner came on the phone and said, "Look, your children, your grandchildren, in other words, our children, are saying, Grandpa, please leave." And actually it was that appeal to the future generations which got him to pack his bags and finally leave. And his house wasn't burnt down. He was fine. But there was a kind of a temporal aspect to that, the appeal of the voice of the grandchildren really, in a way, spoke to him in a way that my voice didn't.
Yes, I can very much relate to that with my dad, who was also a refugee, incidentally, from Poland. I was going to ask you, there's quite a few questions about how we translate this messaging across different sectors. So the one in particular that I'm going to pick up on is how do we ensure that this messaging can be heard within businesses now, especially businesses that are perhaps locked into the standard 3 or 5 year plans, but aren't thinking about the impacts of their business further ahead.
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? More and more businesses are talking about long-termism. I get invited basically every day to talk to some major corporation about how they can become more long-term. And I turn down almost all of those invitations, partly because I don't believe in the commitment of these organizations to a kind of long-termism that goes beyond cathedral thinking, to also include other aspects like intergenerational justice. And it's a complex thing for me because, of course, one can, there are great people in all organizations who are trying to transform their businesses. But I think one of the problems, as we all know, is that the financial and ownership lock-ins that particularly large publicly quoted companies are burdened with means that even if you've got the CEO at the top talking long-term purpose and sustainability, if the shareholders are there basically holding them to short-term ransom, they're not going to get very far. And that, there are many, many cases of this in action. Unilever, Paul Polman, basically a good guy who on the first day he became CEO abolished quarterly reporting and tried to challenge some of the short-termism inherent in the company and, made all these sustainability targets. Well, Unilever was subject to hostile takeover bids, like from, Kraft and others in 2017 or 2018, because they're still a shareholder-owned company, and so that financing and ownership systems are a real challenge. So what's the answer to this? It's really, really difficult. One kind of answer I have here in my hand, right? This is my donut on a stick, donut of social and planetary boundaries, created by the economist Kate Raworth. Many of you will be familiar with this model. I talk about it in my book. Partly, I have to admit, also Kate Raworth is my partner. So a little disclaimer there. But for those of you who don't know the donut, it's like a donut with a hole in it, and there's a social foundation. We need to get people above basics in water, healthcare, energy, and so on. This is based on the Sustainable Development Goals. And outside is the ecological ceiling of ocean acidification and climate change and other boundaries we can't go beyond. This is our global selfie. We are falling short on all of the inner circle of the social foundation and going across the boundary on at least 4 of the planetary boundaries for which we've got good data, and we'd be going over more if we had better data. But the point of the donut, of course, is to say that on a state level, the goal of government shouldn't be grow, 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 grow. It should be about getting into the donut, because we know that there is no systematic evidence of the possibility of decoupling growth from CO2 emissions or material usage at anything like the pace and scale required to stay within safe limits of, say, 1.5 degrees of heating. But this is also something for businesses. Lots of businesses put this kind of model on the table and say, right, how are we going to operate within the boundaries of the donut? It's only one amongst many models. It's certainly a popular one. But I think also the way this works, we can't rely on the voluntarism of businesses either. We need governments to regulate. So again, with the donut as an example, in Amsterdam, many people will know that Amsterdam's adopted the donut as part of its circular economy strategy. And Amsterdam's circular economy goals are ambitious. 100% circular, basically no waste by 2050, 50% circular by 2030. And this is the goal I really like, by 2022, 10% of city procurement has to be circular as well. And what that's doing is it's forcing construction businesses, refuse companies, and other kinds of businesses to start gearing up for a circular economy, right? They're having to change, and that regulatory structures, those boundaries, are really important in kickstarting, pushing businesses to change. And I was giving actually a talk. Sorry, I'll stop answering this question in a minute because it's a big one. But I was giving this talk to some people in Silicon Valley about the importance of operating within planetary boundaries. It's really taking this Janine Benya's idea of living within the boundaries of the one planet we know that sustains life. And some of these people were saying, well, look, we don't like boundaries. Boundaries stops innovation. In businesses, we got to go beyond the boundaries. But boundaries are a source of innovation and creativity. Mozart played on a 5-octave piano, Jimi Hendrix on a 6-string guitar, Serena Williams within the boundaries of the tennis court, within the tram lines. So these kinds of things, like these regulations in Amsterdam, are just like that. They're actually a source of business innovation. And we have to impose those kinds of limits, and businesses also have to call for them as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Roman. Building on that also, sorry, there are so many questions here. I know that I'm definitely not going to be able to get to all of them, but one, again, that's having resonance with the audience is around how we get our politicians and the current political system to embrace this way of thinking. And this actually brings me back to one of the questions I was going to ask you at during the discussion, which is around the 4 fundamental barriers to change, which you mention in your book. The one which I mentioned to you that keeps me up at night is that insufficient sense of crisis, which, of course, the politicians, at least in my country, in Australia, very much seem to reinforce on a constant basis to us. So how can we ensure within our short-term election cycles that long-term thinking is really being embedded in a way that's going to have positive consequences for everyone?
This is the great challenging question, because of course politics is in a way that one of the hearts of the short-term culture in our societies. And how do we challenge at least 200 years, of this sort of short-termism built into electoral cycles, and now made worse by 24/7 news and things like that. Now, I'm involved in some kind of movements and campaigns, as I mentioned in my little talk, to try and, in a way, redesign our political institutions, because I think representative democracy as it currently exists is dying. There's falling faith in traditional parties for the last 30 years across the Western world and in other parts of the world too. The rise of far-right populism is telling us that traditional parties aren't meeting people's needs or insecurities, at least, of various different kinds. So we need to reinvent democracy. And one of those ways, so like in the UK, I'm involved in this campaign to have a Future Generations Commission, which is in fact officially being launched tomorrow. And there's a bill in the UK Parliament right now to have a Future Generations Commission. Now, it's a private member's bill, which means it's unlikely to pass, but it might, and it might generate a public debate about the need to redesign our politics. And I think some of this public debate is happening anyway with the rise, for example, of citizens' assemblies. In many countries, Ireland, Spain, Belgium, Canada, in the UK too, there has been the rise of an interest in this direct, almost ancient Greek participatory method of politics, the citizens' assembly, getting random selections of citizens, getting them to debate stuff. And again, there's growing systematic evidence that citizens' assemblies tend to take a longer view than our regular politicians. I think you've got Graham Smith coming to speak in one of your future weeks. He is the world expert on this kind of stuff, and really interesting talking to him about that. And he knows a lot more about it than I do. But so citizens' assemblies, I think, are an energizing sort of factor. And the way we've been designing the bill in the UK for the well-being of future generations bill is there wouldn't just be, as I said, wouldn't just be a commissioner like in Wales. There'd be a commission made of young people and experts, sort of 8 people, but they would also be informed by a citizens' assembly. And that is one of the ways of trying to create a sort of a deeper sense of democracy in those political processes. But alongside that, I've been studying social movements and political change for 30 years. And one thing I've learned is that you rarely get fundamental reform without disruption, without social movement action on the streets, without people breaking the rules. And this is the story of social change. It's the story of Gandhi and the Indian independence movements against British colonialism and non-violent direct action there. It's the story of the militant actions of suffragettes in the UK. It's the story of the civil rights movement, blocking bridges and holding sit-ins. And it is now the story today of direct action movements like Extinction Rebellion and others, Sunrise Movement, who are causing disruption, making lots of people unhappy because they can't get to work, or MPs or bankers can't get into their offices. But there is a long tradition, political tradition, of this kind of disruption actually being very effective, especially when you've tried everything else, right? We've had 30 years since the Rio conference and the Kyoto Agreement, 30 years of failure to take action on the ecological crisis. I totally understand those who want to try and break that. Now, I personally was at XR protests very, very recently. I don't want to be breaking laws. It's not my choice of thing I like doing with my time. And I'm not out there to try and get arrested. But I recognize that without that kind of disruption, and I admit not everyone can or feels okay being involved in it, but I think some people need to be doing it. Without that kind of disruption, we are not going to get those political changes. We are not going to get future generations commissioners. We're not going to get changes to discount rates. We're not going to get donuts adopted by cities and nations and regions. So I really do believe in the power of disruption this is what a lesson from history, and this is why long-term thinking isn't all about looking at the future. It's about learning very much from the past.
Fantastic. And just building on that, actually, there was a question earlier in the chat which was about a roadmap. Specifically, I love the phrasing of this, so I'm going to read it out just as it is. Surely we must have an idealized roadmap. What is that roadmap? And where is the best example you might refer us to? And I was just going to say that this reminds me of the concept that you bring out in your book around the telos, or the transcendent goal. So I wonder if you could kind of perhaps speak about that as well.
It's a good question. Do I have a roadmap? I'm not sure I've got a direct roadmap. But let me try and say something about that. I mean, in the book, when I talk about these 6 different forms of long-termism, one of them is exactly as you say, Philip, but the idea of having a transcendent goal, what the ancient Greeks called a telos, a goal or objective outside yourself. And we know as individuals, if you pick up a book like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, I think one of the main messages there is that to give us meaning in our lives, we need to have goals which are bigger than us, things which keep us going, whether it's finding a cure for cancer, or keeping the family business going, or bringing up your kids, or creating some amazing social enterprise. This gives us meaning, but we also need this as a species to have a telos or transcendent goal. Carl Sagan, the great astronomer, said that we need a telos for the human species. Now, he was all a bit like Elon Musk, saying, right, our goal, if we want to really survive for the long term, we need to colonize other worlds. The roadmap, in fact, is a space exploration map in that sense, because that's the only way we can stay safe, if we colonize all these other worlds. But as I think you've already heard, I don't think that should be the goal for humankind. I think the primary goal should be what I call one planet thriving, to live within the boundaries of this one planet we know that sustains life. In fact, there's a brilliant book about this. Wait, where is it? Kim Stanley Robinson's sci-fi novel, Aurora. If any of you haven't read this, and like this kind of idea of how to live within planetary boundaries, I really, truly recommend this book, because what it's about, if I just say very, very briefly, I'm a great fan of Kim Stanley Robinson, it's about several thousand people who are put in a spaceship to colonize another world. And it's going to take them about 200 years to get there. So several generations of people have to live and die on the spaceship to get there. And the ship is basically like a mini planet Earth with 12, I think, different biomes, or 24 biomes. There's savanna and tropical. And they need to live within the boundaries, because if they start losing even just 0.1% of phosphorus, it puts everything out of balance, right? And in a way, there is a roadmap in there, a fundamental roadmap, which I think is, consistent with the idea of the donut, which of course is about the social foundation, but it's also about the planetary boundaries. And in a way, that is the ultimate roadmap, because I don't think we can say in any one or specify a set of policies which are going to work in every country, in every place, in the same way. What we need to set is a set of goals. We need to set this kind of telos, like the donut as one example, and just living within planetary boundaries is the most fundamental one, which is the basis of ecological economics. And then ask ourselves, in whatever institution we are in, whether you're talking about your business or your government or your church or your family, how do I live within those boundaries? That's the ultimate in long-term road mapping, I would say. But then, of course, in particular countries, you can start saying, okay, in this country X, maybe the best route to go, if I'm going to choose where to put my energies, I'm going to put it into these legal struggles, or I'm going to put it into citizens' assemblies, or I'm going to put it into circular economy activities. I'm going to put it into saying that my business should have a 100-year sustainability plan, and things like that. So what am I saying here? I've never been one for sort of blueprint solutions. Like my grandfather, where is it here? Wait a second. I can't find it. Well, here's a little book of Karl Marx, right? My grandfather gave me the Marxist reader for my birthday when I was 16. And, he was someone who believed in blueprint solutions. And I don't have that view. I'm sort of more influenced by experimental economics and things like that, that we need to try and test different possibilities, but we do need the telos, because otherwise, where's your long-term thinking going to go? Is it going to go in the direction of long-term greedy or long-term justice? These are the existential choices that we have.
Thank you, Roman. And building on that, there's a fabulous question about what is long-term? What do we consider long-term? Is it, billions of years in the future? Is it decades in the future? And we will actually have an event on this around deep time, but I'm really keen to get your thoughts on what you can consider long-term and how we can address it.
Yeah. So how long is long term? um, I think for anybody or any institution, it's going to be different depending on where you're coming from. So, if you're a church, like a traditional, say, Christian church, you might be thinking on the scale of hundreds of years when you're thinking of your congregations in the future, the buildings you might be building, because you come from in the Catholic tradition, a 2,000-year tradition, or, something similar to that when it comes to in Islamic culture. If you are a, say, impact investor, you think that 10 years is really long term and you're outperforming the rest of the market, which is looking 1 week or 1 month or a few months ahead, maybe if that. And there you can be proud of thinking 10 years ahead. But I would say, so there's, obviously different time horizons in operation depending on institutional positioning. But the way I think about it is that the real barrier here is the ego boundary of our own lifetimes. We find it really hard to think beyond our own lifetimes. And that's exactly why long-termism needs to be precisely at a minimum beyond our own career lengths or our own lifetimes. So for a politician, they might think, yeah, long-term, I'm thinking 10 years ahead. Well, you've got to think beyond your ministerial period or your career. Or I need to think beyond my own lifetime, because only then are you really transcending the self. And this is what this is all about for me. It's about connecting with being a good ancestor with future generations. So in my book, I say that as a rule of thumb, long-term thinking is 100 years. That's one long human lifetime. It gets you beyond your own lifetime. I think 1,000 years is only 10 long lifetimes put end to end. But I think we need to make sure that the long-termism goes into the past as well as the future. So we are thinking about legacies of colonialism, for instance, as well as future impact. So I'd say, as a rule of thumb, I like to work with 100 years. But to be honest, sometimes in some circumstances, if I'm talking to politicians, right, particularly in sort of Western representative systems, I tend to talk about 30 years with them. That's enough. 30 years is as much as 200 years for them, in a sense. If you can get them thinking 30 years, you're really making impact. But actually, I had this really interesting conversation with the Minister for the Future of the United Arab Emirates, which is, of course, not a democratic nation in any sense, but they have this public position of the Minister of the Future, and her job is to plan for the year 2070. So she's looking at least 50 years ahead, which is also really interesting positioning.
Thank you, Roman. And just bringing in a few of the final questions, and just a reminder to everyone that we will be finishing at 1:30 the hour. I've just had a few questions coming through because our last series was an hour long, so this one is definitely an hour and a half, just because these are big topics that we need to discuss. And yes, I wanted to clarify, we will be sharing the recording after the session. As we've been talking about specifics, it won't be immediately after, it will likely be early next week. So I just wanted to clarify that. So a couple of the questions are about, one of the questions that I found really interesting was around intergenerational tensions. And I'm guessing this is from someone in the UK, and it references Brexit. So the question is, how have these tensions affected long-term thinking and an understanding of place, I guess specifically within the UK, but you're welcome to answer it in any context.
Yeah, so I hear about these intergenerational tensions from my kids, who were not supporters of Brexit and saw that the over 65s voted for Brexit, disproportionately compared to people under the age of 30. In fact, I was giving a talk the other day where a woman stood up in the audience, and she was saying about how her son, when the Brexit vote was about to happen a few weeks beforehand, the son wrote to his grandparents who were leavers, who supported Brexit, and wrote and said, look, could you, the son wrote to the grandparents saying, please don't vote for Brexit. This is about my future, about freedom and movement across Europe, about integration, it's about tackling the climate crisis, all these kinds of things. And the woman said that that the grandparents didn't answer the letter until about a few weeks after the vote and came out and said, no, we didn't listen to your letter. We voted what we thought would be best for you, which was to vote Brexit. And this young man who was, I think he was 15, was so upset and so devastated by this. And I think they haven't spoken for a long time since, or didn't speak for a long time afterwards. It was very, very complex. So these are issues which are very personal and very emotional, and therefore very difficult in many ways. And, there are young people's movements across the world who are saying, why should I be paying for the healthcare of older people when they've been pushing up housing prices and I haven't got a home to live in. I'm going to have to rent all my life. Where's the justice in that? So there are a lot of real tensions there, particularly in countries with aging populations. On the other hand, the way I think about it is, I guess, to step back and look at that big picture, that let's project forward to the year 2100, say, and in that world of 2100, there will be old people and young people and middle-aged people and all sorts of different kinds of people in a generational sense. And all of them will need the same thing. Ultimately, they will need, as I've said, air to breathe and water to drink and food to eat in terms of the basics of human life, meeting the basic needs of the donut, or basic social and economic rights. And so there's a kind of ultimately a confluence of what people need if you look at it at that kind of level. Of course, you will always be able to choose a level where you can see conflict between generations. And those conflicts are real and need to be negotiated. There are real issues about housing, costs for young people. That's a real thing. And that there must be an intergenerational discussion there. In fact, what just came to mind then, in Canada, a movement of young people, I can't remember what it's called, but what they did is they campaigned for the Canadian federal budget to always include not just an analysis of how the budget was spent in terms of gender, which had already been established, but spent in terms of intergenerational impact. So how much of the budget is going to younger people or older people, and what are going to be the impacts of different parts of the budget on different generations. And that's the kind of thing which starts creating, I think, a healthy conversation in public culture about intergenerational rights and differences. So I think, the first stage in this is always let's create the public space to have the conversations there, and let's see where it takes us. Let's see where we can find the common ground.
That's a really, really good point. Thank you, Roman. I'll probably have time for one, possibly two last questions. So I hope I choose good ones. But the one that sticks out to me at the moment is that these ideas aren't hugely new. That people have been saying, that we need to think longer term for a long, long time. Historically, societies wait until the painful consequences are actually impacting them. So how do we improve the rate of uptake of these ideas?
It's certainly true that these are not new ideas. I mean, people have been talking about long-termism for, indigenous cultures for millennia, and in Western culture for at least half a millennia. And of course, the impetus or the need for long-term thinking, the urgency of the issue has been brought up by the climate crisis. And I think what's really important in terms of things like the IPCC report are reflective of a larger trend of longer-term thinking in society in the last few decades. I mean, back in the 1980s, if you read something about forecasting, particularly forecasting was kind of colonized, go back to that word, by the business world. Forecasting was about commercial forecasting 3, 5, maybe 10 years ahead. But then along comes the climate crisis, and suddenly there's more public debate about thinking about what are going to be the impacts of sea level rises in 2100 or 2300 or even 2500 in one of the IPCC papers. And I think that's a good thing. But still, where is the uptake? What do we do? A Brazilian person said to me not long ago, she said, in Brazil, we've got a saying, which is something like, you only learn to swim when the water reaches your waist. And I think there is something complex and interesting in that, yeah, we need to have crises in order to act. But even by the time we have the crises, it can be too late. It's too late to learn to swim. You're going to drown. And I think that's the danger of the place that we are now. We are having crises, of course, wildfires, droughts, and, floods, and so on. Yet these crises don't seem to be enough to have kickstarted us. But as someone, Danny Lee, just mentioned in the chat there, the COVID crisis has been really important because it's told us something important. Many things. There's a lot of long-termism in the COVID issue, of course, that it's revealed the need for long-term planning for pandemics. Countries which had long-term plans in place probably dealt with COVID more effectively than those which didn't. But it also speaks to us of what governments can do. Within just a few months, a centre-right or right-wing UK government, a conservative government, was paying people's salaries, shut pubs, stop people flying, close schools. We need to bring the state back in. Back in the 80s, 1980s, there was a big debate about bringing the state back in. Well, now we know what governments can do when put to it, when they feel the crisis. And I think that's inspiring, and that's important, but they will not do it, not because the crises in the natural world aren't enough by themselves to push us. What we also need is to create the sense of crisis, which is what Greta Thunberg's doing, or what XR's been doing, and what social movements do so well. So we need these two. We need the crises of the natural world, which we don't want to wish upon anybody, but we also need to generate the sense of crisis in order to create change. And I think when those two things meet, you start getting the kind of changes we might need. We get that urgency put into practice. But who knows?
Thank you, Roman. Rather than asking another question, although there is a really good one on there about businesses that purport to have net zero targets that they don't meet as a means of greenwashing. I was actually going to ask you if there's anything that you wanted to bring in that you feel we haven't addressed, that you're keen to impart to us before we have to say farewell at the end of this event.
Sure. So look, I've been looking at all these questions and flicking through them as we go, and I feel terrible I haven't been able to answer more of them, because a lot of them are, most of them, in fact, very profound, really important questions. I think the one thing we haven't really touched on is, what do I do in my life when it comes to long-termism? What should I do? And I think that's a challenging thing, because I think we all need to recognize we're all coming from different places, and we need to operate in different ways. Look, for some people, to be a good ancestor is to write a poem. I came across this guy recently who wrote a poem called My Great Great Grand Spider, about a spider in the year 2120. And so for some people, poetry does it. For other people, it's about locking yourself on to the door of JP Morgan, or an investment bank or something like that. For other people, it's taking to the streets. For some people, it's organizing in your community or religious organization, or wherever it happens to be. So I think we need to all find our own place. But I believe absolutely this is an issue so urgent it requires collective action. But I think we need to be nourished by the personal too, which is why for my 50th birthday, which was not that long ago, I went with my kids. We cycled down, my kids and my partner, to visit a 900-year-old yew tree in a local churchyard. And we went and had a picnic up in the branches of this tree, and we talked about deep time. We talked about the fact that the tree will be there, was there during the time of the Black Death and during the Civil War in the 17th century, and will be there long after we are gone. And to realize that, if the age of the earth is the distance from your nose to the tip of your outstretched hand, one stroke of a nail file on your middle finger erases human history. And that's about having a bit of humility. Who are we to break the great chain of life with our ecological destruction and technological risks, which we have imposed on today's world and the future world in just the last couple of 100 years? Who are we to do that? And I think if we remember that question, ultimately, that is how we will remain good ancestors through our lives and share our possibilities with future generations.
Thank you so much, Roman. It's such an inspiring discussion, and we're so fortunate to have you impart your knowledge and wisdom and research to us. So thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. But if you enjoyed this discussion, please do join us next time. This is just the first in a series of events, as we've mentioned. I've posted the links in the chat, although it may be a little while ago, so I'll try and post them again in a second. But before we go, I'd like to, thank you for Jessica, she's just posted them for us. I'd like to invite everyone just to unmute themselves, just as a way of forging some connections across space and time, as we're all in different time zones, just to say goodbye. So if anyone wants to do that, please feel free.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Amazing.
Cool. Thank you.